So around here on Trace Velo, I'm known for doing some really cheap carbon bike builds. I hunt down the cheapest parts that I can find on AliExpress, throw them together in a build, and then put that bike through its paces. One of the last ultra budget bikes that I built was this one here. Actually, I'm really happy with the final result, but I did encounter a number of problems. The cable routing was an absolute nightmare. I had to drill out the frame stops, file down parts of the frame, the saddle kept coming loose, the wheels I chose have a problem retaining the bead on tubeless tyres, and the cheap carbon handlebars had to be binned once they developed a massive crack after just 150 miles. But it was cheap. Well, today, ladies and gentlemen, I have some much more premium parts for this bike build. Many of them still come from AliExpress, but in total, it's going to cost more than double what this thing did. So will spending more money make my life easier and build a better bike? My name, as always, is Luke, and welcome to Trace Velo. Right then, folks, got a great build for you today, fully carbon and fully hydraulic disc brakes. Now, all of the major components for this build come from Chinese manufacturers, but rather than cheaping out as much as possible, like I usually do, I've actually put down some decent money on all the parts for this build. I reckon that spending more cash on some crucial parts will make the build itself go much smoother, and I think the final result could easily be the best bike that I own. So with that being said, let's get straight into the build. But before we jump in, I've got a bit of news, actually. So a few weeks ago, I handed in my resignation to my regular job, which means pretty soon this will be my job, which is it's absolutely bonkers. I mean, I am very nervous about the future. Plus, this episode was quite expensive for me to put together. So to help out, I've got today's sponsor, Sirocco. They make some really awesome cycle clothing. So stick around towards the end to hear a bit more about them and how you can save yourself a bit of cash. Anyway, wish me luck. And yeah, let's go. Right, so the backbone of any build is the frame here, and this carbon fiber beauty is from OG-EVKIN. This is their CF-025 frame. You might also be able to see in the top left up there, I've put the cost. And keep an eye on that, because as we go and I add more parts to this build, I'll update that with a running tally of the costs so you can keep track. Anyway, let's get stuck in. So I bought this thing with my own money during a Black Friday sale on AliExpress. I got it delivered to my house for the cost in the corner, and I didn't get charged any additional import fees, which was great. So while this is a more premium build, that's a pretty great price for this frame. It was really well packaged, not a scratch on it from shipping, and it includes the frame, fork, and seat post. It looks fantastic. The minimal decals and branding are well applied, and it comes with the standard stuff like the compression plug and the headset bearings. But also included was a spare rear derailleur hanger, a small adhesive chain guard or chainring protector, and a rubber seat post clamp cover that goes here. It basically prevents water from creeping into the frame on wet rides. So really nice little additions, actually. These aren't generally included on cheaper frames. So while it looks great externally, I also had a look inside the frame with my endoscope. Very clean overall, no surprises whatsoever really. The bottom bracket area, which is a BB86 press fit type, again very clean. You can see some machining marks, or at least a wear pattern to indicate this area has been reamed out or finished with a tool to ensure proper fitment of the bottom bracket. This would have been an additional step in the manufacturing process, and again, rarely see this on cheaper frames. Now, weight-wise, this frame is pretty good. So on my last build, granted it was more of an aero-focused frame with some chunkier down tubes, but the total weight was 1,946 grams. This OG-EVKIN one is more of a climbing style frame, but comes in at 1,698 grams. So basically, 250 grams lighter, not to be sniffed at, if you ask me. So first things first, I'm going to get the headset bearings seated. Both the top and bottom bearings have chamfered bearing surfaces, so need to be inserted the right way up. I'll stick a bit of grease around the bearing seat and the bearings themselves and pop them in place. After that, I'll get the crown race seated onto the forks and get the steerer tube fed through the frame. All good. Next up, I'm going to fit the handlebars. So these are a fully carbon integrated bar and stem. Same as the frame, they're made by OG-EVKIN and would cost around 120 quid, but they actually sent me these for free, which is cool. Now, 120 quid might seem steep, but in the past, I've had a lot of trouble with cheaper bars. Oh my God! So I think it's about time that I tried some half-decent ones. You can internally route the cables and also sling a computer mount underneath with these screws. Anyway, let's get this thing fitted. Okay, right, so those went on absolutely fine, and I've put some spacers in there as well. So they're actually these from ZTTO. Picked these up on AliExpress, so I'll update the cost in the corner. I think they were £4.30p. Anyway, right, so it's 3 centimeters worth of spacers here, and it might seem a little bit excessive, but what I'm trying to do is basically, this bike on the wall is a very comfortable bike for me. I love the riding position, and in order to emulate that handlebar stack height there, to translate that across to this frame, just so happens that I need 3 centimeters of spacers. As I get more comfortable with the bike, I might end up dropping this down a little bit, but for now, that's what I'm going with. Anyway, now I've got my stack height here sorted, I can cut this steerer tube to length, but to make sure this compression plug here can do its job properly, I actually need to cut the steerer about 5 millimeters below the top of the stem, somewhere about there. This provides room for the compression plug itself and also some additional space to be able to kind of compress and preload the headset bearings. Basically, this is a really important cut, so make sure you measure twice and you have all your heights correct before you do it. So when cutting steerer tubes, you should use a tool like this that kind of sits on the steerer tube and helps guide that cut to be nice and square. I don't own one of those, and I never have. I've just done it by eye every time. But on one of my last videos, a commenter suggested this hack, and it's absolutely genius. So I've got 2 old stems here, and I've just left a gap between them where I want the cut to go. So yeah, that's basically really hoping that's gonna leave a nice clean cut there. So thank you to Velofarine, I think the commenter was for that. Yeah, high budget build. Still got some low budget hacks though. So firstly, carbon dust is no joke. It can be pretty harmful. So I've stuck on a mask, and I'm also spraying the area down with water as an extra precaution. Now, I think you can buy specialist saw blades for carbon fiber, but I obviously didn't bother with that bollocks. I've always just used a bog standard hacksaw blade, and it always comes out absolutely fine. Look at that cut there. It's absolutely perfect, completely square. Look, who needs to buy the proper tool when you can just completely scuff up and potentially ruin 2 perfectly good stems that, now I'm thinking about it, probably have a greater financial value than the tool itself would have cost in the first place. Still, it worked. I'm happy. Good hack. Anyway, next up, I took some sandpaper around the edge of the cut to prevent any splintering and stuck a bit of carbon grip paste down the tube to help the compression plug grip. Now, when working on carbon bikes, it's generally advised you use a torque wrench. My one was about 40 quid from Amazon, I think, well worth it for peace of mind when assembling stuff like this. And here, with a compression plug in a carbon steerer, I would suggest no more than 8 Newton meters on this bolt. Okay, so the front of the bike here is set up and good to go. So next step with this build is to get the Groupset on. So let's check it out. So it should come as no surprise that the Groupset I've chosen for this build is the L-TWOO RX, a fully hydraulic road Groupset and the very first of its kind to come from a Chinese manufacturer. I've already covered this Groupset in some detail during my initial unboxing video, so check that out if you haven't already, but here are the highlights. It's 2x12 speed and comes with shifters, front derailleur, rear derailleur, both brake calipers, and a whole host of mounting brackets. It follows the Shimano standard for the hydraulic fittings, which is really useful, and features a bunch of carbon parts, like both brake levers, both shift paddles, and part of the rear derailleur cage. Now, it cost me 358 quid from AliExpress, and they also offer a 2x11 version and a gravel-specific 1x12 version if you are interested. In fact, I'll probably be installing the gravel version later on this week, actually, on my gravel bike, so yeah, get subscribed for that. Now, I do need to make a correction. In my unboxing, I mentioned that the included calipers are a post-mount standard, and while they do look like it, I was actually completely wrong, and these are in fact a flat mount caliper. Essentially, post-mount calipers have the bolt spacing at 74 millimeters, and these are 70 millimeters apart, making them flat mount. Right, before we get this group set here on the bike, at the end of my unboxing video, I mentioned that the left shifter for the front derailleur was really stiff and it wasn't very nice to use. Reading the comments, someone suggested there's a bolt here in the back that you could adjust. So I loosened it off very slightly and voila, I am basically back to nice smooth shifting with this thing. Do be careful if you're playing around with that bolt yourself though. I think it holds the whole shifter assembly together, so don't loosen it off too much. Anyway, now that's all sorted, let's get all this on the bike. Okay, first things first, let's get the shifters mounted onto the bars. Very straightforward, just slide them on and clamp them in place using the nut located under the rubber grips. This can actually be quite fiddly as the grips don't pull back super easily, and you can see here I'm kind of struggling to get my Allen key in place. Anyway, tighten them down between 6 and 8 Newton meters, and let's get the brakes mounted. Now, the calipers come with hydraulic brake hoses already attached, but as mentioned during my unboxing, the brake hose for the front caliper had a kink in it from the factory. Now, I presume this happened during the packing process, and at the time, I wasn't too fussed. However, after reading through the comments, many of them were right, in the sense that while it's not a big deal for me as I can replace the brake line if necessary, it probably shouldn't have left the factory this way. Now, as it happens, I've actually got my hands on another 2 of these group sets, and neither have kinks in the brake lines, so could be a one-off, but it does make me wonder if anything else got pushed out the door by L-TWOO when maybe it shouldn't have. Food for thought anyway. Now, routing the brake hoses through the frame was very easy. In the past, I've had to file down parts of the frame to get the brake lines to feed through, but this time, no problems at all. Routing them through the integrated bars was also a piece of cake. Took me literally seconds to do, which if you know anything about the integrated bars I've dealt with in the past, this is pretty much unprecedented. Normally takes me at least 40 minutes to get this done. Anyway, when mounting the calipers to the adapter plates and subsequently to the frame, I'm using a bit of anti-seize compound here on the bolts. Essentially, these bolts low down on the bike are getting sprayed with water and crud from the road constantly, and in my experience without it, they can suffer galvanic corrosion between the aluminium and the steel of the bolts, but I am aware this definitely isn't recommended by the manufacturer. So let me know, is this something you do yourself on your builds? Anyway, now the calipers are fitted, time to slap on the derailleurs. And again, you can see a little bit of anti-seize compound here on the bolts, and there we are, all good to go. Okay, so at this point, the group set is basically fitted to the bike. So I've got both shifters on, I've got the front and rear calipers loosely fitted to the frame, as well as the front and rear derailleurs. And it's worth pointing out that it has been really simple so far. I mean, even running the hydraulic brake hose for the rear caliper all the way through the frame, and then it popping out the side here, and then feeding it through the bars was really straightforward. I'm used to kind of wrestling with cabling like this on cheaper frames, but with this setup, it's been really straightforward. It has been helped out quite considerably by my internal cable routing kit here. It's a relatively new purchase for me, and it's already paid for itself like twice over. So definitely recommend one of those if you're tackling a job like this. Next up, while the bottom bracket is out and I've still got access to kind of bits in here, I'm gonna get the cable runs done as well. So the group set came with the gear cables here, so I'll get them cut to size, run the cable housings as well. So I will see you back here in a few minutes. So once again, the choice of handlebars and frame made routing and cutting the gear cables here incredibly easy. I mean, this probably took me like 20 minutes, maybe less, and here's the result. Okay, so the gear cabling is, well, it's complete and it looks really nice. I'm super chuffed with it, nice and tidy, but you might notice there's no inline barrel adjuster on any of these cables, and that's because the front derailleur doesn't actually require one. So using this arm on the front here and this screw, you can change the tension on the front derailleur cable directly on the front derailleur itself, negating the need for a separate inline barrel adjuster, which is cool. And it was very simple to cable this bike actually. So the theme of simplicity with this build continues, which is quite refreshing. Now I'm playing around with the shifting at the back, and you can downshift 3 gears at a time, but you can upshift 1, 2, 3, 4 gears. So it means you can absolutely smash your way through the gears at the back. Really interested to try this out on the road. The front derailleur works perfectly as well, but there's one slight concern I have with these shifters. Okay, so I've attached these shifters onto the bars here, and I've tightened up this clamping band in the back via a nut inside the shifter. I've done it up as tight as I dare, basically, but I can still quite easily move the shifter from side to side without a lot of force, and it's exactly the same on the other set of shifters there. I'm slightly concerned that if I do up the clamping nut in the back here, if I do it up any tighter, something is gonna break, because I've had that exact issue on another set of L-TWOO shifters I've dealt with in the past. So I'm kind of leaving this here as a note to myself in case anything goes wrong when I tighten it up further. For now, I'm gonna leave it here. So let's check out some really tasty wheels. So these are a great looking set of wheels from a company called 9Velo. Now 9Velo is a new brand, but the company behind them has been producing carbon wheels for over 12 years. These look incredible. The build quality seems top tier as well. Now the rim is carbon. These ones here are 35 millimeters deep, and following the industry trend, they're also nice and wide too. So externally, they're 28 millimeters with an internal width of 21 millimeters, basically purpose built to run wider 28C tires. They're also laced with carbon spokes. Now I've used a number of wheel sets in the past that use carbon spokes like these. I've had absolutely no issues, and I've got a lot of faith in them. Weight-wise, they're also pretty freaking light as well, including rim tape and tubeless valves, 1,338 grams for the pair. Pretty damn good. Now, they are pretty premium and would cost 1,169 bucks, or just under 950 quid, but I got these free for the purposes of testing and review, and I can actually get you 10% off with the link in the description. Now, I obviously need to get some more miles on them before I review them fully, but if you did want to check them out, you can do. And I'll be running them tubeless with some 28C tires. These ones here are 75 quid for the pair. Vredestein Forteza tires, I think they're Dutch. I've used them before, really nice ones actually. So a year or two back, I bought myself this blue Airshot canister for mounting tubeless tires. Absolute game changer. You can mount them without it, and I did struggle by with just a track pump for a few years, but my word, does this thing make my life so much easier. Also, I'm usually a stands man for my sealant, but variety is the spice of life, or so I'm told. So I'm using this orange seal stuff. Yeah, I've heard good things. Now, disc rotors. I've tried a number of cheaper alternatives in the past. I'm still rocking these lightweight rotors from AliExpress on my gravel bike that cost me a grand total of 7 quid. But as this build is a little higher budget, I've got these Shimano Ultegra Ice Tech rotors. The massive aluminium fins mean they're great for heat dissipation and will set you back about 100 quid for both of these. Now, the cassette. I've gone Shimano again. This is the 12-speed cassette from the new 105 Di2 Groupset actually. It's 1134, so massive range for a road cassette, to be honest. I would be much happier with an 11 to 28 round here where I live, but yeah, that doesn't actually exist with this cassette. So here we are. Anyway, got a good deal on this one, 60 quid new for this thing on eBay. Not too shabby. Anyway, good little setup for these wheels, I think. So let's crack on. Okay, so now the wheels are set up and on the bike, this thing, yeah, it's really starting to come together, which is awesome. So regarding these shifters that were a little loose on the bars here, whilst I was putting the wheels on, I took the time to loosen off this clamping band, move the shifters down the bar a little bit, and then I put some carbon grip paste in that area. So when I slid them back up, there was a little bit more friction. And since I've tightened them back up, yeah, they seem to be pretty rock solid now, which is great. So that's that problem solved. Next up, I'm going to cut the brake hoses at the front to length and then bleed the brakes. Now, regarding this front brake hose, you may recall it's got a kink in the cable there. Luckily, if I just cut it just above the kink, right there, I should still have plenty of hose left to be able to plumb it into the back of the shifter, which is awesome. I wasn't really looking forward to having to replace that brake hose. So that's a bit of a lucky break actually. Anyway, let's get that done right now. So the first step here is to get the brake lines cut to length. And when that's done, get the barbs fitted into the end of that brake hose. Now there is a proper tool to fit these barbs, but I've always managed to kind of tap them in place with a small pin hammer. Yeah, seems to work for me. Next, get the clamping nut and an olive onto the end, stick a bit of grease around there and get it seated into the back of the shifter. Then get that nut screwed in to kind of clamp it all down. Now, in retrospect, this step would have been far easier if I hadn't already clamped the shifters onto the bars. This definitely added an extra hour or so of faffing around with this step. But the fact that the fittings for the shifter are on this flexible hose did make it easier actually. And just for reference, the hoses and hydraulic fittings used here seem to be the Shimano BH59 standard. Now, bleeding the brakes, I won't go into too much detail here as L-TWOO already have a pretty decent video out explaining how to do this, which I'll link in the description. It's the video that I followed here to get it done, and yeah, there were basically no surprises. It was pretty straightforward. You'll need the Shimano standard mineral oil and a basic bleed kit. In fact, I will say this bleed kit that I bought from Amazon was, yeah, it was excellent. It had everything I needed and it was like 13 quid. So I'll pop that down in the description as well. Okay, so after admittedly quite a long afternoon faffing around getting these set up, they're all good to go. So the brakes work and the gear shifting's fine, but there is a slight issue with these. So let me get my mic close to them and you can hear it for yourself. Can you hear that rattling? So it's coming from somewhere inside the shifters and it happens on both, and I'm gonna have to figure out where that's coming from because if I had that out on the road, it would annoy me no end. So I'm gonna try and figure out where it's coming from. Right then, after doing a little bit of investigation around here, I've actually ended up pulling both brake levers off of the bike here. Now they come off super easily, so here's one. They just require two little screws, just like that, and you just unscrew them both and the lever pops off, and it's really easy to put back on as well, so I wouldn't worry too much about maintaining this or anything. And now I've done that, the rattling is, yeah, it's completely gone. So I know for a fact that the rattling stems from somewhere in here, this little mechanism inside. So I'm probably gonna put a bit of grease around this, see if I can dampen that rattling, so wish me luck. Well, still rattles, that wasn't the problem.
Mission failed. We'll get them next time.
Right then, I've just figured this out, so let me get the camera in the tripod. Okay, so this took a little while to figure out. So this is the brake lever and this is the mechanism inside that I thought was the culprit. This doesn't rattle at all, even without any grease on, this doesn't really make a sound. And yet this didn't make a sound either when I was kind of tapping it, but check this out. So that's the piston there for the hydraulic brakes. And around it is this little metal ring. And when it's depressed, the ring comes loose. And that is exactly the thing which rattles around. So when the piston isn't depressed like this, it doesn't make a noise, only when it's very slightly depressed. And that's essentially what happens when you use this free stroke adjustment screw here. When you screw that in, it essentially pre-depresses the piston in there, and that's what leads to the rattle. So I've figured it out. Basically, I'm gonna put a little bit of grease in here and see if that solves the problem. Okay, so that is fixed. No more rattling. So let's get the bottom bracket and the crank on. So this is pretty simple stuff. Bottom bracket here is a BB86 press fit type from ZTTO. Cost me 15 quid from AliExpress. Easy. So I'll clean out the BB shell on the frame with a bit of alcohol, slap a thin film of grease in there too, and let's get cracking. Now this bottom bracket actually threads together, which is nice, and uses a generic Shimano bottom bracket tool to fit it. It's the same one you use to fit these pretty standard BSA threaded bottom brackets, if you're familiar with those. So I assume many of you will have one of these tools hanging around, but if not, they're mega cheap. I think the one I'm using here was less than 10 quid. Anyway, now that's fitted, let's move on to the crankset. So this is a compact 50-34 tooth crankset with 170mm crank arms. But the cool thing about this is that the arms are hollow. It's really lightweight as a result and comes in at 646 grams. One of the lightest I've ever fitted, actually. Cost me 84 quid from AliExpress. Goldix, yeah, bit of an interesting brand name there. And it's basically an all aluminium construction, including that axle. Honestly, after inspecting it closely, it seems okay, but I think if you're putting out massive watts in the sprints, yeah, hollowing out the cranks like this, yeah, could be a little risky. Anyway, only one way to find out. So let's get a dab of grease on the axle and get it installed. Next up, let's fit the chain. So this is from YBN and cost me 20 quid from AliExpress. They're actually a Taiwanese brand. I've heard good things, and I've also heard a rumor they make the chains for Campagnolo. So yeah, I've got really high hopes. Anyway, let's get it sized. There are loads of tutorials online, but I tend to size based on the largest sprocket on the cassette and the largest chainring. So now that's done, on to the most dangerous job of the day, using an open flame to fit the heat shrink tubing to the end of the gear cables. Okay, right, I am very near the end at this point, so all that's left is to put the Bartape on, get the pedals fitted, and slap on the saddle. I've also had to play around with the gear, so these are all indexed up, and gear shifting is really, really nice, at least on the stand anyway, so I'm really excited to get this out on the road. So let's button the last few bits up. So, Bartape, I actually prefer the really cheap stuff. I think this was like 8 quid from eBay. It looks good, it's comfortable, and importantly, it has no adhesive backing. So yeah, it's just much easier to install, and it never comes loose in my experience. The saddle, now that is that's an interesting one. It's actually 3D printed, or at least the rubber padding on the top is. It has this honeycomb structure in the rubber, which looks really cool. It also has a carbon base and carbon rails. It's from a brand called Zeus or Zeus, and cost me just over 90 quid. As it happens, I've already been riding this on another bike for the past few months, and I really like it. Looks good, it's light, and it's comfortable. Lastly, the pedals. As it happens, I have a set of Time Espresso pedals in my drawer from a comparison video I did a while back with some pedals from a company called Costello. Yeah, fantastic episode, if I do say so myself. But yeah, I quite like this pedal system actually. So these are going on 212 quid. I paid for these on Amazon. And with that, yeah, the bike is complete. Okay, right, here it is. And it's finished. I am super chuffed with it. I think it looks absolutely pucker. Really, really chuffed. And the Bartape job as well. I think it might well be the best one I've ever done, actually. Anyway, all working, all looks great, so I'm gonna get this thing out on the road.
1 hour later.
Okay, so I've just finished the first shakedown ride on this bike, and there are 2 small issues with the chainring area up the front here, so let me show you. Okay, so the first thing I've actually already fixed. It was really easy to do. So let me get the camera in position and I'll explain the problem. Okay, so this is the front derailleur hanger here, and you can see this trailing edge is rounded off on the corner. That's got a rounded corner there. It wasn't like that before, so it was actually squared off, if you can imagine, like so, just squared off. And that actually interfered with this little radius on the front derailleur. So rather than it sitting like this, it actually sat like slightly cocked off to one angle, which then interfered with the shifting at the front. So I just took a file and filed that down. I'll see if I can bring the camera around to show you. Can you see it's kind of filed off there? Really, really easy to do. So that was about 5 minutes to fix that. But the second is an issue with the shifting. Okay, so this second issue is actually to do with the chain line here. So when I'm in the smallest sprocket at the back and the largest ring up the front, this issue occurs. So let me get around the front here. So I'm pedaling away, and you should be able to see the chain starts lifting off the chain ring there, essentially, because the chain is coming off the outside edge of this chain ring. So that's a super simple fix. All I need to do is put some spacers in behind this chain ring here, maybe 1 or 2 millimeters, just bring this out very slightly, and that should be problem solved. Now, it's worth pointing out that with both of these issues, they would be nearly impossible to account for when selecting parts for a build like this. These are just the kind of things that you have to look out for when doing shakedown rides. Anyway, with those 2 things fixed, this bike is done. So let's cover the final cost, the final weight of the bike, and I'll also tell you whether this thing was worth it.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Right, so quickly, today's sponsor, Sirocco. So Sirocco makes some really awesome looking cycling gear that I've genuinely worn on every ride for well over 2 years now. It's all super comfortable stuff with some really high quality fabrics and construction. I mean, each garment has these nice high quality little touches like reinforcing on high traffic areas like pockets, and the extensive use of flat lock stitching, which creates a strong and flexible seam that also lays flat against the body for comfort. So look, there's a reason that I've worked with Sirocco for so long. I really do love their stuff. It's just great quality, no nonsense cycle gear for a great price as well. So if you did want to pick up some stuff, anything from cycle glasses to socks, gilets, bib shorts, jerseys, then use my link in the description down below. Save yourself 10% off the entire site, and it also helps me out a bit as well. Anyway, thank you for listening, and if you did pick up something from Sirocco, thank you for supporting the sponsors that support me. Anyway, let's crack on. Okay, then let's just jump straight in because most of you will have skipped to this part of the video. Anyway, so the final cost for the build was £2,403.44, or just under 2,900 bucks. So just for comparison, the build I did a few months back that had a much greater focus on value. It was essentially the cheapest fully carbon disc brake road bike that I could build. That was less than half. So that was £1,083, or just over 1,300 bucks. Okay, let's get the final weigh-in for this bike done. So I'll turn on the scales here. And just for context, I've got the Garmin mount up the front. I'm running, well, both sets of pedals are on the bike, including pedal extenders actually. And I've got the bottle cage on. So let's get this on the scales like so. And it's swinging. And the final weight is 7.665 kilos. So just over 7.6 kilos. Pretty good actually. I think I could probably drop about 100 grams off the bike if I swapped out this quite heavy cassette here for the monoblock S-Road cassette that I've got on my other bike, but still, just over 7.6 kilos. I am very happy. And again, for comparison, my previous ultra budget build comes in at 7.94 kilograms. So this one is lighter, and most of that is to do with the frame actually. So this is a more lightweight climbing style frame, whereas the other one has a much more aero focus, so it's going to be a little heavier as a result. So more than twice as much and a little bit lighter. So was it worth it? Well, yes, I think it was actually, and there are 3 facets to this. So firstly, this was a much easier bike to build. Now granted, setting up and bleeding fully hydraulic disc brakes can be a bit more complicated than setting up the mechanical disc brakes that were on my other bike, but actually once you get down to it, it's pretty straightforward, to be honest with you. But yeah, in terms of ease of building, this bike definitely takes the cake, mainly thanks to the frame and the integrated bars actually. So just running the brake lines and the gear cables and just throwing parts onto this frame in general during the build was very simple, which really helped. Secondly, this is just a better bike, if you ask me. It still feels fast and nimble, but thanks to the more compliant frame, these really lovely wheels and the chunkier 28C tires, it's a very comfortable bike to ride. Plus, the fully hydraulic disc brakes, yeah, they're a welcome upgrade over mechanical disc. And thirdly, and most importantly, in my opinion, this build has just been less faff. Now, it hasn't been completely faff-free, but a lot of the stuff on here has just worked in ways it didn't with the cheaper build. This seat post has been rock solid, hasn't slipped into the frame at all. This nice little rubber cover here means I don't have to seal this area with silicone sealant like I did with the other bike. And this saddle clamp has been, well, it just works. I haven't had to add any shims, adjust anything, file anything down. I just put the saddle in, tightened it up, and I was finished. The frame even came with the adapters for larger diameter oval saddle rails in the box. Just everything about this build has been easier and honestly more confidence inspiring. So now this is done and I've been smashing out some miles on it. What are my initial impressions? Now, I'm only about 120, 130 miles into this bike by now, so caveats all round. This is obviously subject to change, but this is a nice bike. So let's start with the Groupset. The braking is honestly excellent, as good as any other fully hydraulic setup that I've ridden in the past. I'm sure some ultra premium Dura-Ace hydraulic brakes are technically better, but I would probably struggle to tell the difference. These are very good brakes. Now the shifting, it is good and it is accurate when it's dialed in, which can take a while. And I do love the ability to absolutely smash through the gears. So dropping 4 gears really quickly at the back with one swing of that thumb trigger on the shifter, very satisfying. However, sometimes the actual shift lever up the front, that doesn't reset fully, which can then block that thumb trigger for the rear cassette, and it often leads to a misshift. Now Joe from China Cycling mentioned this issue in his rundown of the Groupset, and I have exactly the same problem actually. So it's difficult for me to show you when it's in the stand, but essentially this tends to happen when you're out and about. So this is the lever here which downshifts at the cassette. So you push it up and it essentially moves the chain up the cassette, so it downshifts at the back. When you're using it, sometimes it will get caught here. So this is its fully reset position here. Sometimes the lever will rest here and you don't really notice it. And when that happens, it actually blocks the action of this thumb trigger here. Sometimes you can kind of overpower it by pressing this down quite hard, but that often leads to a miss shift. Now it's intermittent and certainly doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it can be quite annoying. Now I think I might be able to address the issue using this grub screw, which is located up inside the shifter here. It essentially means that the shift paddle sits, rather than here, sits a bit further back, like so. Failing that, I might also try and adjust that screw which sits in the back of the shifter mechanism that I mentioned earlier. So I'm gonna have to have an experiment, play around and report back. But luckily, it's a very intermittent issue, so I'm not super fussed. Other than that, there are a few other things to be aware of with this Groupset. So the grub screw that sets the free stroke adjustment, you'll probably need to screw that in when you set it up yourself. I certainly had to, but be careful, it's not captive. So if you screw it in too much, it'll just pop out the back. And then to get it back in place, you'll most likely have to pull the brake lever off the front to kind of get access. Not the biggest deal in the world, because I showed you it just uses those 2 screws, but still a little bit annoying. When the main piston inside the shifter is pre-depressed, thanks to that grub screw that I just showed you, it does rattle, but like I said, put some grease in there and that should solve that problem. The brake pads that come with this Groupset are a ceramic and copper compound, according to L-TWOO. They're actually very good, but they can be replaced with the generic Shimano brake pads. They're L-05A pads. Even the ones with the IceTech fins actually fit perfectly in these calipers too, which is pretty cool. But lastly, there is a distinct lack of any documentation or guidance included with this Groupset. I mean, you literally get nothing at all. I don't think it's particularly difficult to set up and install, but then I've done this many times in the past. I'm very familiar with this process. For someone that's not so familiar, there are no torque specifications, no guidance on how to route or replace any of the cables or hoses, installing the barbs into the end of the brake hose and using the olives to crimp into the back of the shifter. No instructions on any of that. Even selecting the right adapter plate for the brake calipers took me a little while to work that out. It was quite confusing actually. Plus any replacement parts like replacement hoses or hydraulic fittings and replacement brake pads. I worked out what they are, but like this information should come either included in the box or at least be available somewhere on the L-TWOO website. Now I am aware this is pretty much par for the course with a lot of these cheaper Chinese alternatives. I mean, I certainly wasn't surprised when there were no instructions included. But if L-TWOO really do want to compete with the big boys, they should include some documentation. It would certainly make life easier for people that aren't super familiar with installing Groupsets like these, which, if I think about it, is probably quite a lot of the target market for something like this. So overall, as Joe from China Cycling mentioned in his rundown of the Groupset, it's very close to being a top tier product. I think with a little bit of adjustment, the shifting will be spot on and the braking performance is certainly very good. There are just a couple of things holding it back in my opinion. But then again, the price point is really hard to ignore. I think I'm just gonna have to get some more miles on this and report back. Oh, and very quickly, during his video, Joe mentioned that using the same IceTech disc rotors that I'm using on this one, the tops of them fouled against the brake caliper, but no problems with me in that department, plenty of clearance actually. Now everything else on the bike has been great so far, to be honest with you. Love the frame, love the wheels, love the bars, and love the saddle. No annoying rattles, nothing has come loose or anything like that, so as ever, just gonna have to smash out some miles on it and report back. Oh, and links for pretty much everything I've showcased in this video down there in the description as well. Right then, moral of the story, spending that little bit extra on bike parts can really pay off, especially if you're a little less experienced in building bikes like this, or maybe you just cannot be bothered to deal with the faff that inevitably comes when choosing ultra budget bike parts. Yeah, big ass episode today. Probably took weeks for me to pull this together actually. So if you could subscribe and hit the like button, I would really appreciate it. And tell me, did you like the build? Is there anything that you wanted to see or anything that was missing? Like I said at the beginning, I am resigning soon to do this full time. And at the end of the day, I make these videos for you lot to watch. So yeah, tell me what you want to see. And failing that, drop some baguette emojis into the chat. I think I saw the other day a comment that said, well, it referred to everyone as Baguette Nation. I love it, absolutely love it. So as the French say, muy bien.
Oh yeah, I really love France. My favourite thing is the paella.
Right, well, that is that. So I will see you all next time. Ciao.